either yellow-bellied marmots, and these marmots were filmed at Bryce Canyon, which is in Utah. So yellow-bellied marmots are kind of awesome. They're social. Unlike gray squirrels, these guys are social. And one of the things they practice is vigilance behavior. So that's what this animal is doing. He's vigilant. He's looking out for potential predators. And the predators are going to include hawks and eagles and foxes and coyotes and things of that sort. A number of years ago, I was up in the Grand Tetons, and I was really fortunate. I was watching these marmots, and I saw this coyote coming across the snow. And this was late spring, but there was still snow on the ground. And this coyote came up, and he was heading right to where the marmots were, so I got my camera out, and he came back down the hill about 5 minutes later, and this coyote, which weighs about 35 pounds, was carrying one of these marmots, which weighs about 15, just lugging this marmot down the hill. So he had obviously killed the marmot, and then he stashed it somewhere, and about 20 minutes later he came back up looking for another marmot. So he was stashing these things to feed on later. So these guys do suffer significant predation. This is a video clip, and you can see that this guy is just sitting there, just waiting. Now, one thing about this particular location and time is this is, I think it's the first week of September. So this is probably the last yellow-bellied marmot out for the year, okay? Because typically, end of August, these guys shut everything down and they go into hibernation. And it's sort of a weird hibernation for a couple of reasons. One is they're really too big to hibernate. Animals that are, usually animals that are above 500 grams are not able to hibernate. So, for example, bears do not hibernate. Hibernation means you drop your body temperature down to 4 degrees centigrade and keep it there. And if you think about it, that means when you come out of hibernation, you have to raise your body temperature from 4 degrees centigrade up to 37 degrees centigrade. So for a bear, in order for a bear to do that, that means the bear has to store enough fat to heat, a 600, 700, 800 pound animal from 4 degrees up to 37 degrees. Well, how many calories do you get from a gram of fat? Well, you get roughly 9 calories, right? So you can then figure out how many calories are required to raise a gram, of water 1 degree centigrade, and then you realize that this bear is going to have to store about 2,000 pounds of fat. So clearly, a grizzly bear or a polar bear is not going to be capable of hibernation. They simply can't store that kind of fat. So they don't hibernate. What they do is they go into something called torpor. So they allow their body temperature to drop a little bit, but not all the way down to 4 degrees. These guys, however, do drop their body temperatures all the way down to 4 degrees, and they do it every day, and they come out of hibernation every day. So it's really a weird system that we simply don't understand very well. So this guy, if you're doing the ethogram for this guy, it's a long period of vigilance. Now there is another animal that comes into the frame here just a little bit. See if we can move this forward. This is like a 15-minute video. There are two animals. They're both being vigilant, right? This is the end of the season. These guys are calling it quits. It's still warm out there. There's still a lot of grass. There's still a lot of green vegetation out there. And yet these guys are calling it quits. And the question is why? And the answer is there simply isn't enough caloric value left in any of the vegetation that's out there to make it worthwhile to feed. So the nutritional quality of the food that's left is, oh, look at that, man. just moving right over the other guy, okay? There isn't enough nutritional quality left in this food for these guys to get any benefit from staying active. So rather than expose themselves to potential predation, they're going to go underground. And they're going to stay underground from basically all through September, all the way until May. So September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, right? That's 9 months out of the year that these guys are underground. So everything that happens in their life needs to happen in those few months that they're above ground. So that puts a premium on what they're doing. So these are animals that are, via natural selection, adapted with a very specific series of behaviors. That's different from what you see in prairie dogs, okay? So I have clips of Prairie. Get out of that. Prairie dogs. And these prairie dogs, this is, I think, in Wind Cave, South Dakota. So there's some cool things that are happening with the prairie dog. So this is an animal that's being vigilant. You would refer to that as quadrupedal vigilance. Okay, let's move it forward here. That out of there. There are some social interactions that take place between these animals. It's having a hard time loading. There's one animal right there. So at any rate, what I'm asking you to do is to prepare an ethogram, right, that sequence of behaviors for the marmots. So here he's feeding, right? So he's not being vigilant, he's feeding, but watch, his head is going to come up and he's going to pause, so he has a period then of vigilance, okay? And this was also late in the season, but I do have video for these guys from all seasons, okay? So what we're going to do as part of our lab exercise is we're going to compare, right, these ethograms that we developed, these sequential behavior sequences for the marmot, for these prairie dogs, and then for our gray squirrels, okay? We don't want to invest too much time on that. One of my former graduate students has done, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of video she had for the prairie dogs, and we have similar hundreds of hours of video for the yellow-bellied marmots, and I'm just asking you to do 15 minutes of it. But I will show you the results of their work once you've gone through that stuff so that you can get a sense of what the behavioral differences are between the prairie dogs and the marmots, and then we can compare that with what we get for the prairie dogs. So that's one thing that I want to get taken care of. All right. The other thing that I want to point out is I put the squirrel tray data up, and there's an issue with the squirrel tray data. Whoops, I think I already have it up. What I've done is I've entered all of your all of the UTM coordinates that were on the handheld GPS units that you use. So these were the ones from the Wednesday lab, and these are the transect points, right? So these students went like that and then made that turn, right? So there's, and I'm calling that P transects. Group 2, S transects, so that's the next, that's on the Friday group. There's the trans, so they did a similar thing. They went down like that and then over like that. There's one weird dot right there like that. I don't know what that's all about. Okay. Whoops, I have more. So there's the P transects for the group 1, S transects group 1. So the 9th, the 11th, the 9th, and the 11th. So it's all sorted. Okay. Something happened here. These students made a turn for some reason. But at each point, right, I include the distances for these transects. So here the students went 285.6. So those are the distances that you need when you're using your program. Okay, so that's all good. I don't have any complaints with that. Here, 378 meters, 217, 279, and this one is sort of weird. This one is 739 meters, which is considerably longer, so I don't know if that was entered in error, and that should be the terminus right there. But that final distance goes from there to there, so I will leave that to you to decide. Perhaps you know which of these transects was yours, okay? So maybe then you can figure that out for me. So that's not the issue that I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about are these data. So these are the data that we have. This is transect 2 and then one lonely transect 3, right? So here's the angle. I'm fine with that, so angle in degrees. And then distance in yards, I'm fine with all of that. The only thing I'm concerned about is for the people that did that transect, was that really only they only found one squirrel on the second part of their transect. I don't know. Okay, but that one doesn't concern me too much. This next one is broken up into transect 1 and 2. Okay, that all looks good. Angle and distances. This one looks fine, angles and distances. The one that's sort of squirrely is this squirrely, right? The one that's sort of weird is this one right here. They've broken it up into drays and squirrels, which is good, okay? But the issue is here, for example, the distance is 115 meters, but they recorded no angle. Yes?
That was our group when we did that because like the squirrel was on the ground.
Yeah, I figured that out, but it still would have been at some angle from where you were, okay? So if you can mentally say, oh yeah, you're not there now. Was it at a 45-degree angle, a 90-degree angle? Just ballpark it for us, okay? So that we can put some values in there, okay? So we just need to know roughly. It's going to be approximate, that's fine. We just want some numbers to put in there. The only other option is to simply delete those observations, and I would rather not do that. If it was, oh yeah, it was roughly the same as the one immediately before it, then that's fine, okay? So that's the only thing we need fixed. Once that's fixed, if you guys can email it to me, I will fix that, and then you'll be ready to use that in program distance, okay? We all good with that? Excellent. All right. Let's get started then. I'm not going to do all of this material. I'm going to skip through a fair bit of this. When I'm going to give you some stuff to read when we meet for lab this week. Because there are a couple of things that we're doing, that we're getting ready to do. Because we are not going to be using the vans, we're not going to go visit one of the cemeteries and do one of the traditional labs that I've always done, and that is record data from headstones. What I will do for you is I will provide you with all of the data from those tombstones so that we can start working on survivorship and things of that sort. And the reason we need those survivorship data is that we can work a little bit on models of population growth and population density and things of that sort. So that's a continuation of that. And today what I want to start talking about is demography and population growth. Okay? But the The other thing that we're doing, and that's in conjunction with your ethograms and so on, is we're going to do a module on optimal foraging. So I'm going to start giving you some readings and whatnot for lab this week, and we're going to be out and we're actually going to be doing a more detailed sequential behavior thing for our gray squirrels this week, weather permitting. And then we're going to, from that, transition into a problem on optimal foraging. So some of your readings are going to concern optimal foraging and this notion, something called giving up densities. Giving up density is the point at which you give up on feeding in a particular patch. And you can think of that like when you go to the all-you-can-eat buffet, right? You go to the all-you-can-eat buffet and there are all these things that you like, and when you first start eating, you choose the stuff that you like best, right? Why do you like it best? Well, you're hungry for that particular food item, maybe because you have a salt deficit, or maybe because it's sweet and you need the calories, or who knows what. But you have certain preferred food items, and you feed on that, but there's a point at which you give up on that particular food item. If you like the shrimp that are in this salad and you go to the all-you-can-eat buffet and you're just picking the shrimp out of the salad, as the abundance of the shrimp drops below a certain point, you give up on trying to dig the shrimp out of the salad. Okay? That's called the giving up density. Well, squirrels do exactly the same thing. And we can learn a lot about the biology of the squirrel by understanding what the giving up density is. So one of the activities that we're going to do is we're going to compare a variety of food items and a variety of foraging scenarios. So situations where feeding is dangerous versus situations where feeding is safe. Situations where the concentration of food is high versus where it's low. And try and determine what the giving up density is. We'll have a series of predictions that we'll develop in class that will enable us then to predict what the animal is going to do. And if the animal actually does that, then we'll know that our understanding of the system is correct. All right, so before we move on into all that in the lab, what we want to do is start talking about demography and population growth. And I'm going to skip some of this or just go through it very quickly. And that is concerned sort of what is the population and so on. What parameters can we measure? And how, and importantly for us, how do populations differ in terms of their density, which we've started to address with program distance, and age distribution and other sorts of parameters. If you think about where we are today as a country, much of the situation that we're in is a consequence of stuff that happened 80 years ago. Okay? So you're not living in a vacuum. You're not living your own free, consequence-free life or anything of that sort. What you're facing today is a consequence of what happened in my parents' generation, right? So they dealt with the Depression, and they dealt with the Second World War. And following the Second World War, right, all of these people after this long Depression and after this long, ugly, horrible war came back, and all people wanted to do was settle down, some peace and quiet, and have a family, and they did. And that produced the baby boom. And the baby boom was this huge influx of new bodies, new humans into the population. So there was suddenly this explosion of young people. And in the 60s, those young people were the source of all evil, the source of all protest and all of that sort of stuff, the source of all the social changes that we've gone through, right? Those people, universities were exploding in population size. That was a time when fresh PhDs were getting recruited out of graduate school. Before they had even finished their degrees, they were getting teaching jobs at major universities just with the promise that they would get their PhD. student populations were growing so fast, universities were popping up left and right. In California, roughly, I mean, I don't know what the proportion is, but a large number of California state universities were formed in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They just started springing up everywhere to handle this huge number of students that came in. So the baby boom ultimately went bust, and that's where you come in. Because you're in that bust phase, and now, right, there are all these PhDs out there hanging on to jobs. You're trying to get a job, and the job that you want is essentially being occupied by some old geezer like me, who's not going to give it up easily, right? So you're in a totally different scenario. My generation is retiring, relying on Social Security, using up all those Social Security funds because the government has been borrowing against that money forever, so that by the time you're my age, ready to retire, there will unlikely be any Social Security left for you. Okay? So all of those sorts of cultural and social changes that we've gone through are a consequence of this one demographic event. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works out mathematically and so on later. But those are the sorts of things that we care about. Okay? So what I want to do today is talk about how populations grow, and then how we can model that population growth. Okay. Also, once we understand how a population grows, then we want to ask ourselves, how are populations controlled? Well, we know a little bit about that already. Remember, we were talking about lemmings committing suicide, that whole concept of group selection. Well, back in the 1960s, that was the idea, right? That populations don't get too large because of group selection. So some animals, for the good of the population, will not reproduce or kill themselves or something. We know that is a silly idea. Okay? So what is it that limits population size? And then what is it that affects population stability? So what is it that keeps a population at a relatively stable number? All of that stuff is actually pretty easy to deal with. And then, of course, the other thing that we've already started to talk a little bit about is how do organisms budget their energy, right, so that they're maximizing their inclusive fitness. So should the animals concentrate on their own survivorship? Should they concentrate on the survival of their offspring? Should they put more energy into reproduction or less? Okay, those are all important sorts of evolutionary questions. Okay? All right. All right, so let's skip through all of that, and what I want to do is, first of all, yeah, I don't want to talk about that. Okay. Let me just say this. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut this PowerPoint down and just instead do this on the board. So let's first think about what a population is. Okay. Well, it's a group of potentially interbreeding individuals. Okay. Let's think about one interesting example, and I think we might have already talked about this. Let's think about flying squirrels. If we draw a map of the U.S., there's Alaska. I know you're all absolutely amazed by my artistic skills. There's Florida. There's Mexico. There's Baja. There's California and all that sort of stuff. We have 3 species of flying squirrels in North America. Okay? And we know that the flying squirrels came into the New World across the Bering Land Bridge like that. So they're Asian in origin. And the parent species for the flying squirrel, Glaucomes, is a species called Eoglaucomes. And that's in the Himalayas. So these guys came over like this, and one group went down through the Sierras like that. As a matter of fact, these are the Sierra Mountains up there, and there are the San Bernardino Mountains right there. And there are roughly, between here and there is 600 miles. But there's a population of flying squirrels right there, 600 miles separated from everybody else. Then there's this other group of flying squirrels that came all the way across Canada and the northern tier of states, Wyoming and even down as far south as South Dakota. There's this little island population of northern flying squirrels like that in the Black Hills of South Dakota, isolated by hundreds of miles from the next population. Then some of those squirrels came down like that and followed the Appalachians. So they come down. So here's one species, here's species number 2, and then there's a third species which does this. It's throughout the entire southeastern US, all the way down into Florida. Okay? For this species right here, there is, down in Guatemala, Honduras, and southern Mexico, on a couple of island mountain peaks, species number 3 as well. Okay? So the first question is, what the heck? How did they get down there? How did these guys get over? Because between here and there, right, is not forest habitat. Flying squirrels, they're called flying squirrels because they fly, well, not really, they glide. They glide from one tree to the next. If there are no trees, there are no flying squirrels. It's that simple. All right? Are no trees between there and there. So how the heck did these guys get there? Between here and there is desert. That's Chihuahuan Desert. How the heck did these guys get there from there? Hooked a ride on an 18-wheeler? No. They've been isolated down there for a long, long time. Long before humans got here. How do they get down there? What do you think? What are the possibilities? Who's had biogeography with Taylor? Nobody? How the hell did they get down there? Okay. What is the current really scary thing that's happening to our planet? No idea? No clue? It's not that scary. What's going on right now in terms of the climate?
Global warming?
Yeah, I mean, you can call it global warming, but more reasonably, it's just climate change, right? Because the amount of temperature increase isn't really all that meaningful. What matters is the daily and seasonal temperature amplitude variation, right? That's the important part. I love it when a politician will say, you know, in the middle of winter in the northern hemisphere, in the Senate, they'll bring up a debate about global warming, and some senator will come in with a snowball and say, you think it's getting warm out there? And hold up a snowball. You know, and all you can think is, well, you dipwad, you know, go down to Australia, where it is now summer, and find out how warm it is down there. Or look at the polar, right, ice caps, either north or south, and realize how small they have gotten, right, how they've, or if you've not yet been to Glacier National Park I suggest you go soon because those glaciers are almost gone. Okay? They'll have to change the name of Glacier National Park to, used to be Glaciers National Park or something. All right? What I mean is that things change. Habitats change. We weren't always hardwood deciduous forest. Okay? Where is the Missouri River?
So through like South Dakota,
Yeah, it goes from South Dakota, and
what comes all the way down to Missouri.
where does it run into the Mississippi?
I don't remember. I think it's somewhere in Missouri.
Oh, don't give me that bullshit. You need to get out more. You need to spend more time ootin' the boot, man. Where does the Missouri River run into the Mississippi? Where does it dump into the Mississippi? Don't give me this. Don't tell me that you don't know. St. Louis. You go up Interstate 55, boom, boom, you're going right over the bridge. There's the Missouri River, man. Don't tell me you didn't know that. You're just shy. You didn't want to say anything because you thought I'd make fun of you. Okay. Sorry. Why is the Missouri River where the Missouri River is? Better yet, if you've ever gone north from here, and instead of staying on the freeway, or even stay on the freeway, I don't care, just go straight north. What happens once you get north of St. Louis? How is the terrain different? Who likes to hunt? So you go deer hunting here, what do you use?
I use a slug gun.
You're from Illinois?
Rifle,
What?
30-06.
Yeah. So why are you using basically a shotgun?
Well, I mean, bigger deer are taking in slow states. So I'd rather use a slug gun than a rifle.
But you're hunting in Illinois, right?
Correct.
So what's the range?
Nowadays, it's probably between 90 yards and 120 yards. As far as you can reach.
So what kind of range do you get? Far better than 90 or 100 yards. Why such short? The reason you're using a slug gun in Illinois is because that's all you can use,
Right.
right? They won't let you use it. Why won't they let you use anything with a longer range?
You have to have some publication or some legislation.
Because the land is flat.
Oh, where I'm at, it's completely hilly.
Yeah, but you're in southern Illinois, but you get north of the Missouri River, and what's the land in Illinois like? Flat as a pancake, man. And what the politicians are concerned about is some bullet going like that and running into some guy's car or tractor or house or something of that sort because the land is flat. I mean, the politicians sometimes are stupid, but not always, right? So why is the land flat? Because, right, back in the Pleistocene, there was this glacier that came down from the north and scoured out that whole area like this giant file, just filing off everything, scouring it out and making it flat. And that glacier came down, and the southern tip of that glacier was where the Missouri River is now. When you go north of the Missouri River, it's flat. South of the Missouri River, you got the Ozarks. That's as far as that glacier got. So now, have you ever been in a place where there's a glacier? The weather is different, okay? The temperatures are cooler. What's the vegetation like? It's primarily coniferous forests. So you have all these coniferous forests, okay, right there at the bottom side of the glacier. And if you if you go through all the pollen samples that you're pulling up out of the soil, you go down deep enough, suddenly all the pollen that you're finding, the fossilized pollen that you're finding, right there at the southern tip of that glacier is coniferous forest, which is not what we have today. Today we have hardwood deciduous forest. So as the glacier came down, the climate was cool and even cold right in front of that glacier. And that means that all this area down here was pines and conifers. Okay? And guess what? Northern flying squirrels, you find them in pines and conifers. The southern flying squirrels are always associated with hardwood deciduous forests. Where were the hardwood deciduous forests? The hardwood deciduous forests were down here. As the glacier retreated, the coniferous forest followed it up. The hardwood deciduous forest came north then, obviously not within a decade or two, but over many tens of thousands of years. So what you saw was this shift in where these different sorts of vegetation were. Okay? So it used to be where we are now was all pine trees, fir trees, hemlocks, and things of that sort. Perfect habitat for northern flying squirrels. But as the glacier retreated, all that stuff went north, or went up in elevation. Okay? Because what happens as you go up in elevation? It gets cooler and it gets wetter. So the conifers went up in elevation or they went north. So now where do you find all the pine trees and fir trees? In the Appalachians. Or in the Sierras. You go downslope and then you get into the scrubs and deserts and things of that sort. But upslope you find all the wet stuff. So what happened to these guys is that all used to be hardwood deciduous forest. But as the glacier retreated, the hardwood deciduous forest went north and up in elevation. And there's still a little bit of hardwood deciduous forest left on the tops of these mountains. And that's where those squirrels got trapped. So now that little patch of hardwood deciduous forest on the top of those mountains is totally surrounded by desert. And they can't get off because they can't walk through the desert. They can't glide through the desert, so they're stuck there. And they've been stuck there since the Pleistocene. Okay? It's the same thing how these guys got down here, because at one point the vegetation was different. That was all coniferous forest throughout there. And as the climate shifted, as all those forests moved north and up, they got trapped on the top of the San Bernardino Mountains. And they can't get off because they're surrounded by desert. So those are populations. Are those guys, is that population the same as this population? No. They are not potentially inbreeding or interbreeding with these guys. So this is a separate population from this one up here. Okay? All right. So we now know a little bit about what populations are. Interestingly enough, it's only been in the last few years that we've recognized this group of flying squirrels right here as a separate species from that group up there. And that was work done by, he was a graduate student. He was at Humboldt State for a number of years, and now he's in North Carolina. But he was, as a grad student, he was up in this area right here, sampling DNA and whatnot out of the flying squirrels up there. And then he came down here and was over in there and whatnot. And he figured out that these were two separate lineages. So what happened when flying squirrels came over, they came over as one species. There was a speciation event right here, and one group went down like that and became isolated and then became genetically distinct. Another group went over here like that, and then another group came down like this and speciated. So we started off with one species, we now have three. And nobody has been down in Mexico to do modern genetic testing on these guys down there in 30 years. So you're looking for a really cool PhD project, you want to spend some time in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, be on mountaintops, hardwood deciduous forest, it'd be an awesome PhD project. Is it still the same species or are they species? Okay. Now we know what a population is, right? It's a group of interbreeding individuals. So just being a member of the same species doesn't mean we're a member of the same population. All right, let's think a little bit about how populations grow. As an example, let's look at days. So this is day 0. And let's see, this is somewhere around day 60 or 70 or something like that. And let's look at the number of COVID cases at SEMO. Okay? And what would that graph look like? So cumulative number of COVID cases. Yeah. Through July, August, 1 or 2, 3 or 4. School starts. And it went up like that. Last Thursday, there were 33 cases of students. So we're now at, 183 cases. And of course, I don't know what. So the day before, there were 17 or 15 cases. The day before, there were 14 cases. The day before, there were 11. The day before, there were 6 or 7. The day before, there were 3 or 4. So suddenly, it's just really taken off. Okay? So it's growing exponentially. What does that mean, that it's growing exponentially? What does that tell you? I mean, this isn't anything new. You could have Anthony Fauci, right, the infectious disease fellow from the CDC, right, has been talking about that forever. Remember at the outbreak of this, at the start of this outbreak, people were talking about flattening the curve. Notice how we don't talk about flattening the curve anymore. What they wanted to do, right, they wanted, instead of getting something like that, they wanted to do something like that. Okay? That was the objective. And the only place that was able to do that, initially at least, was New York. Okay, so there's a fundamental difference between those two curves. Let's look at the human population, the total human population, and see what that looks like. I'm going to donate this one to the classroom because it no longer works. So let's go back to the time of Jesus. The birth of Christ, right there. How many people were on the planet?
A few million.
Yeah, a couple million. And it stayed like that for a long time. So here's about the year 1000. And here's roughly the year 2000. And here we are, 2020. So it stays like that, roughly like that. Okay? What was going on in the year 1000? What were the major geopolitical events? No clue? When was the first pope installed? It wasn't before Jesus, I can guarantee you that. Okay. When was the first pope? Roughly in there, 200, year 250, 300, something like that, somewhere in that ballpark. Why? Why do we have a pope? Where does that whole concept come from?
It's Roman, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hierarchy.
Yeah, so the emperor of Rome, suddenly it becomes the Holy Roman Empire. Why is it the Holy Roman Empire instead of just the Roman Empire? All right, so what was the Roman Empire? How far did the Roman Empire extend back then?
Pretty well through the known world.
Yeah. So it was into Africa. It was into what's now Turkey, Greece, right? What used to be part of the Soviet Union, right? Belarus, all those sorts of places. All the way up into the Nordic states, the British Isles, right? Throughout Europe. Basically, it's everywhere in the New World, or everywhere in the Old World, right? Probably didn't get into China. Why not in China? What's going on in China? They have their own Eastern religions, right? So here you have this empire. Culturally, are the people in the British Isles, in the Nordic countries, in Europe, in Southern Europe, in Africa, do they all have the same culture? No. They're fundamentally different. They have different ways of doing. It's a very disparate, sort of distinct kind of population. So the Roman Empire, in an effort to bring everything together and keep everything united, they have to have something that ties all of these people together. And what they decided to do was to use religion. So they had a state-sanctioned religion. And that was the Catholic Church. Okay? So they used that Pope, they installed the Pope as the head of this church to bring all of the culturally mandated, bring all these people together under one religious umbrella. The Romans didn't give one whit about religion, but they used that as a tool to keep everything socially united. Unlike what we're doing today, in this country at least, where everything is being fractured and torn apart, there the idea was to bring everybody together. Okay? So 1,000 years ago, you have all of these battles, Constantinople and all of that sort of stuff. All of those battles, right, over religion and territory and all of that sort of stuff, the population is still relatively small. What happens shortly thereafter? The population begins to grow like that. Actually grows a little bit, not quite so steep. It's actually going something like that, okay? What enables it suddenly to take off like that? Why doesn't it just continue on like that? What causes that increase?
You said the mention
So, okay. It's not the Industrial Revolution. Simply so. Personal hygiene. How do we know that? Rich people, the upper classes, a woman would get pregnant, she would go to a hospital to have her baby. The surgeon that would help deliver the baby had been down in the basement cutting up a cadaver. doing surgery on somebody that died and was filled with gangrene or whatever, come up without washing himself, deliver the baby, immediately infect the baby and infect the mother and the baby die. Right? Poor women would go to the nunnery, right, to the convent, give birth there, and the nuns were fanatical about being clean. And they were using soap. And the survival rate for women that gave birth in a convent was much higher than the survival rate of women giving birth in a hospital. And that's how people figured out that soap was the key. They didn't understand germs yet, right? But they knew that soap, washing, right? I mean, think about it. Why did people not drink water back in those days? They drank ale. Why did they drink ale?
Because it was cleaner than water.
It was cleaner than water because it gets heated up, right? So all the bacteria and whatnot are dead. You drink water. I mean, what was sewage like? Has anybody here ever been in an old European city? You know, in the old parts of London or Lüneburg or something like that, or Amsterdam, you get into these old parts of the town. What are the buildings like? The streets are narrow because they're designed for horses and carts to go through, not cars and trucks. And then the second floor overhangs the first floor. And that's so that on the second floor, every night or every morning, you can empty the chamber pot. You just open up the window and you take the full chamber pot and throw all this stuff out onto the street. And because it's overhanging, it doesn't splash against your house. So all this sewage is in the middle of the street. People didn't bathe, right? My father-in-law took a bath once a week, whether he needed it or not. And on every Saturday, he changed his underwear and he changed his socks. Otherwise, he wore the same thing every day. Okay, same underpants, same socks, all week long. And his view was that bathing and showering were unhealthy. And yes, he stank. Okay? So it's basically hygiene, right? That's what enables the pop. So now the question is, how large can this population get? How many people are in the population now? How many people live in the U.S.?
Roughly 350 million.
Yeah, about 370 million. Sorry. About 370 million people. How many people live worldwide? Across the globe, how many humans are there?
Like 4 or 5 billion.
It's about 7 billion. About 7 billion people. Okay. So the U.S. represents roughly 5% of the world's population. Okay. Why is that meaningful? In other words, we don't have a high population density in this country. And yet, what proportion of the world's COVID deaths do we have? What other countries have roughly the same number of COVID deaths that we do? Can you list the 4 countries? India, third world country. Brazil, a third world country. Mexico, a third world country. And us. We have more COVID deaths than anybody else. So we account for something like 25% of all COVID deaths. And yet, we've only got 5% of the population. Does that tell you anything about how we've approached this? What do you think? You think we're doing? We're just doing just fine. We're cool. We're good. Save the economy, man. The governor of Florida just opened up, removed all restrictions from bars and restaurants in Florida, in spite of the fact that they're having this surge in cases and deaths. Because you got to save the businesses. At some point you have to ask yourself, man, are we too stupid to live? And the answer is yeah, apparently. Okay. All right, I'll stop ranting now. So, let's look at this growth curve and ask the question, can you see the Holocaust on here? How many people, how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust? 6 million. It doesn't even show up as a blip on this curve. How many Americans died in the Vietnam War? 50,000. In other words, 1/4 of the number of people that have died from COVID. How many people died in 9/11? Boy, that was a tragedy, wasn't it? And 9/11, that was horrific, you know? I mean, we were all upset. Only 3,000 people died there. We're at 200,000 Americans have died, man. So, 9/11, that was nothing. Vietnam War, nothing. We got a memorial to that thing. We got a memorial to 9/11. Are we going to put up a memorial to all the... And the projection is, by December, we're going to have 400,000 deaths. What's the fastest growing age group for COVID-19? You guys. Your age group. Doesn't mean you're going to die. Okay. The death rate is only about 5%. Okay. The reason I point that out, you don't even see those things on here as a blip. AIDS doesn't even show up as a little blip. And I'm just doing that to show you the scale of this thing right here is so enormous. And the question is, how large can it get? What's going to happen at some point? At some point, well, let's think about it. We have 370 million people in this country, right? Everybody has enough to eat, right? Oh no, that's what all those food pantries are all about, yeah. Okay, so we grow all of our own food, right? Yeah, for the most part. I mean, we bring watermelons in from Mexico and avocados in from Mexico in the winter and stuff, but we basically could supply it. We grow enough food that we provide food to other countries too. We sell, well, we used to sell soybeans and all that sort of stuff to China. We don't do that anymore. But, you know, if we double the US population, will we have enough food? What do you think? If we double the unit, so say we have 400 million now, if we're at 800 million people, where are we going to get the food? Okay, are they building new houses and housing developments and whatnot around St. Louis and Cape and all that? Sure, where are new houses going up in Cape? Yeah.
On farmland?
On farmland. My son lives in Idaho Falls. Where are they putting new houses? I mean, Idaho Falls, the population is growing really rapidly. Where their farmers are selling their farms. It's getting developed as houses. In other words, the farmland is disappearing because the farmland is perfect land for building houses. It's nice and it's flat, right? So all this farmland is being, so in other words, the number of arable acres is going down as the population size increases. So can we double our agricultural output? We're not going to have more land. Oh, we can always grow crops out in the desert, right? Oh, wait, no, we can't. Why not? Because there's no water. Right now, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and even Utah are all in this legal battle that's been going on for 50 years over who owns the rights to the water that's coming out of the Colorado River. There's not enough water to go around. Okay, you don't think about it because we're right here on the Mississippi. But there isn't enough water. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago in California, they had to make a decision. Who gets the water? Do the farmers get the water or do the people get the water? They had laws in California, you cannot wash your car. You cannot turn on your sprinklers, right? You cannot fill your pool because they needed that water for the farmers. They had water restrictions. That's where the whole concept of these 1.6 gallon toilets comes from. Trump likes to complain about how, how these modern toilets don't work, and he blames it on Obama, right? Those 1.6 gallon flush toilets have been there for a long time, and they're there because of an effort to save water. Because we don't have enough. You do here, but out west they don't. So, no, you're not going to convert desert into farmland because there's not enough water. So where are we going to get all this at? So obviously we have to increase productivity of the land that we have. Okay? So what is the equation for photosynthesis? What's the equation for respiration? How does respiration work? So you eat a candy bar, what's in the candy bar?
Sugar.
C6H12O6, right? So what do you do with the candy bar? You combine it with the sugar, you combine it with what? What are you breathing in? Oxygen. And that gives you what? What are you exhaling?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide. And what else? What's the other byproduct? Water, and what else? Energy. Okay? And you're using that energy, right, to convert ADP to ATP. You're using that excess energy for fat and whatever else, right? But that's where you get your energy. So you're saving that stuff, right? So that's respiration. You eat a candy bar, you burn it, right? You're using oxygen to burn it, and you're converting it into CO2 and water. What do you do with the CO2? You exhale it. What do you do with the water? You pee it out. The rest of it, that's the energy that you want out of it. Okay, that's what you're going for, is that stuff right there. You're using that to put fat down, or to move, or to whatever else. What does a plant do? A plant does exactly the same thing, only in the other direction. So the plant takes in water, takes in CO2 from the atmosphere, uses the energy from the sun to drive that reaction, and gives off oxygen, and lays down sugar. And the sugar that it lays down is in the form of cellulose or starch. Okay? Your potato puts it down as starch. Your tree puts it down as cellulose. The important thing is it's giving off, where does all of the oxygen on the planet come from that makes your life possible? Right there. That's where it comes from. So you know that the plants were here before the animals, because before you can have respiration, you have to have photosynthesis. That's the process of photosynthesis going that way, respiration going that way. So now we know what respiration is. CO2 plus H2O, right? And that gives us then the sugars plus the oxygen. So if we want to increase the amount of photosynthesis, we want to increase the amount of crops, the food that we're eating, right? The corn and the rice and whatever else, right? If we want to run the equation in this way, we need to either increase the amount of H2O, which we can't do because we don't have more, or we can increase the amount of CO2, which we're doing a damn good job of, okay? Or we can increase the amount of energy, which is sort of determined by the sun, and we don't have any control over that. So really, the whole process is limited. So in answer to the question, can we double agricultural output? No, we can't. Right now, I mean, we might be able to improve it 5%. With genetic engineering, maybe we can improve it by 10%. But as those plants get bigger, they shade each other, and then you cut down on the amount of available energy. There comes a point at which the amount of available CO2 saturates the plant, and any more CO2 doesn't help. Okay? So we're essentially at our agricultural limit, within maybe 10, maybe 15% if we're really amazing. We're pretty well tapped out. So what's going to happen if our population doubles in size?
We'll run out of food.
Yeah. So we'll then be importers of food rather than exporters of food. Which is fine. Unless, of course, you're buying your food from China. If you're buying your food from China, they too have a growing population. So at some point, they run into the same problem. At some point, there simply isn't enough food to go around. So let's look at how a population changes in size. Okay? Mathematically, how can we describe population growth? Let's look at delta N, which is change in population size, over change in time. So if delta means change, what's that going to be equal to? Delta N over delta T is equal to what? Okay, you're confused by the deltas. Let's do it as a differential equation, dn dt. How many of you have had calculus or pre-calculus? Anybody? One person? Two people? So what kind of an equation would use dn dt? What's that class of equations called? It's a differential equation, right? So it's a differential equation. Remember, in calculus, you're learning two things, really. There's only two things you really need to learn out of calculus. Differential, right, differentiation, differential equation. And the other one is integration, right? So you're trying to find the area underneath a function, and or you're trying to find, right, the differential equation. Why do you want the differential equation? What happens when you take the first derivative of a differential equation? What are you finding? The slope of the tangent line at any point, okay? Which then enables you to do maxima and minima and things of that sort. So here's the simple differential equation. Okay? What's it equal? Well, it's going to be equal to R times N, where R is the growth rate. You need to know calculus for this class? No, you do not. Will you ever have to solve this equation? No, you will not. Okay? What sort of a graph does this equation produce? It produces that graph. Okay? That's the equation for exponential growth. Let's think about it. You start off with one bacterium, one E. coli. 30 minutes later, you've got 2. 30 minutes later, you've got 4. 30 minutes later, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, and 1024, and so on. Sequence look familiar? Think about the number of bytes or kilobytes or megabytes or gigabytes that you have on your thumb drive or on your hard drive. All right? 1 gigabyte, 2, 4, 8, 16. Same sequences you see on a flash card. That's because the memory is growing exponentially. It's the same pattern. Okay? If you plot those numbers, that's the curve that you get. What is the growth rate really? What determines the growth rate? Okay. I think you know, right? What determines the growth rate of the population?
Talking about resources available.
Yeah, more basic than that. What's even more basic than the number of resources? All right, so if the population's going to grow, what has to happen?
We have to make.
Yeah, got to make babies, right? So part of this is births. So the growth rate is really equal to the birth rate, right? We'll call that B, minus what? Minus the death rate. So the growth rate is equal to the birth rate minus the death rate. And what's happening now in the human population is that the birth rate is higher than the death rate. So as long as the birth rate is greater than the death rate, the growth rate is going to be positive. So, if we want to solve the population problem, what shall we do? Well, we have 2 options, right? We can either reduce the birth rate or we can increase the death rate. It appears that at the moment, what we're desperately trying to do is increase the death rate. Unfortunately, we're not doing a good enough job. Okay, but if it continues, it could be quite interesting, right? I mean, you have to ask yourself, how many deaths are we willing to tolerate from COVID-19? I mean, right now we're at 204, 205,000 people, right? Probably be 400, 500,000 by the end of the year. It's a lot of people, right? Goes on for another 3 or 4 months, it'll probably be 1 million people. At some point, people will say, hey, that's kind of scary, maybe I should, you know, like keep my distance and wear a mask or something. Who knows? So what can we do? We can increase the death rate or we can decrease the birth rate. What shall we do? What's your preference? How can we bring this population under control? So maybe you don't understand the significance of the problem. So do you have an apartment? Who has an apartment versus living in a dorm? Live in an apartment? What do you pay for rent? $650 a month. Okay. When I was in your situation, living in California, I paid $185 a month for my apartment. 2-bedroom, and I split that with my roommate. 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment, pool, garage, 2 blocks from campus. Sweet. Downside was that it was right next to the freeway, but that's all right. Okay? That same apartment today, the rent, I think I looked it up just recently, the rent was like $3,875 a month. Imagine you're living in Southern California, and this was not, you know, a spectacular apartment, it was just run of the mill. Imagine you live in California, now what's minimum wage? $7.50 an hour? So that means you work 10 hours, okay, you make $75, okay? That means you make $300 a week. That means you make $1,200 a month. And the apartment costs $3,000, $8,000, $4,000. Oops. So what are you going to do? Well, how many roommates do you need? So in that 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment, you're going to get like 10 other people. And that's what they do. You know, you got 10 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment. That's kind of cool. Gotta be friends. Strict rules. You willing to live like that? Share an apartment with 9 other people? What's going to happen to the cost of groceries? As the demand goes up, the supply doesn't increase, right? The availability of food is not going to go up by very much. That means the cost of food is going to go up. As the available housing, right, gets less and less, the rents are going to go up. What will that do to your standard of living? Your standard of living is going to go down. It's not going to improve, it's going to decrease. Okay? What that means is the standard of living that you can expect out of life is going to be less than the standard of living your parents enjoyed. That was true for my generation, it'll be true for you too. All right? So what should we do? If we don't want that scenario, what do we need to do? Reduce the birth rate or increase the death rate? Tell me 5 things that we can do.
Family planning, the birth rate reduction.
Yeah, how's that going to work? Yeah, I'm all about family planning, right? Except that What's the problem with promoting family planning in the current political environment? What's the problem? What's the problem with current family planning? All right, so how many of you had a meaningful sex education course in high school? What did they teach you in your sex education course in high school? Maybe things have changed from when my kids were in high school. But their sex education course in high school was primarily about drugs. Just say no, Nancy Reagan's whole thing, right? Just say no to drugs. And the other part of it was keep your virginity, right? That's what there was no discussion of reproductive cycles. There was no discussion of how it works. There was no discussion of how to protect yourself. None of that sort of stuff. It was all just don't do it, right? Don't have sex until you're married. Save yourself for marriage. Okay, that was the sum total of their sex education course, period. No discussion of diseases, anything of that sort, just don't do it. And they were in the public schools right here in Cape. So what did you learn in your sex, or did you get sex education in school?
I went to a private Christian school.
So the answer is no. Okay, save yourself for marriage.
Yeah.
Okay? You get sex education? What do they teach you?
It's a little more involved. They do actually talk about like condom information. It's not just abstinence anymore, at least where I went to school and
Yeah.
a little bit in Middle Missouri.
Yeah.
They talked about a few birth control methods and mostly STDs.
You got a better education than my kids did.
Mine was still abstinence, but then they used all the things like birth control, all that, diseases is what I did not do it.
Yeah, so they're trying to tell you why you shouldn't have sex. Right? So is that going to help in terms of family planning? Because my guess is, for most people in your age group, don't take it the wrong way, but my guess is that most people in your age group are probably not practicing abstinence. Okay? I might be wrong, but I think that most of you don't do that. And as a dad, right, I'm telling you, for God's sakes, do not wait until marriage to have sex with your partner. Practice beforehand. Make sure that, we're all on the same page here. That's what I'm telling you. Okay? Because otherwise, you could have a miserable damn life in front of you. In terms of family planning, what the government has done is shut down. What has the Trump administration's response been to Planned Parenthood, which is a family planning organization? How have they responded to Planned Parenthood?
Defund.
Yeah, defund it. Which is exactly the wrong thing to do. They're concerned about abortion. You don't want abortion, fine, right? But don't cut the one, federal sort of family planning thing that we have. It's stupid. Does Donald Trump care about family planning? Does Donald Trump care about abortion? You wonder how many abortions he's paid for, right? No. So family planning, I don't think is the answer, not in the current political climate. So what do we do? Well, family planning's out. How else can we bring the birth rate down? There was a book published back in the 1960s called The Population Bomb by a guy named Paul Ehrlich out of Stanford, and it did more harm than good, unfortunately, but the premise of the book was that we needed to solve this problem right here. And his suggestion was that we take the birth rate and reduce the birth rate to about 1.9. So in other words, that every woman has on average 1.9 babies. So we want to get below the replacement rate, right? So if every woman produces 2 babies, right, then the population is going to grow and grow and grow and grow. If you get up below 2 babies, then the population is going to stabilize and come down a little bit, okay? And we clearly don't practice that. And people hated the idea, especially if you're Catholic, right? Because Catholicism is all about having, if you're Hispanic, it's all about having a big family. If you're Mormon, it's all about having big families. My son lives in Idaho Falls, it's Mormon country. You want to buy a house in Idaho Falls, and the question is, do you want 7 bedrooms, or do you want 9 bedrooms? I mean, they have these houses with enormous numbers of bedrooms. I said, no man, I just, 2 bedroom, 1 bath thing, it's just me, Can't do it. So people were so offended and so outraged by the idea, and they're always going, yeah, right, I'm going to have 0.9 babies, that'll work. Yeah, 1.9. So people just simply are statistical idiots. They couldn't, so it did more harm than good, and people totally ignored it. And see, we're fine. The population, of course, has more than doubled since then, but right? That was his idea. So reduce the number of births per mother. How can we reduce the number of births per mother? What other strategies could we employ? What other strategies could we employ? You want to convince Americans to have fewer babies? What could you do? What could the government do? What did the Chinese do? The Chinese were in a similar bind, and they came up with a very interesting solution.
One-child policy?
Yeah, it was the one-child model. So every family was allowed to have 1 child. Okay? And it did bring the population significantly under control in a hurry. Okay? What was the consequence of that one-child policy?
Yeah, they wanted males.
Yeah, they only wanted sons, right?
That's what it was.
Yeah, they just wanted sons because it's a patriarchal society, right? Everything happens through the paternal lineage. Females don't matter. So why did they abandon the one-child policy? Because about 20 years into this thing, they go, hey, would you look at that? All these sons out there and no daughters. What happened to all the daughters? The birth rate should be 50-50. What happened to the daughters was that some peasant woman would give birth to a daughter and she'd take it out to the rice paddy and drown it. Because you're only allowed 1 and she wanted a son. Okay? So suddenly, there they are, all these 18-year-old males and no daughters. Well, there were a handful of daughters. Imagine you're a dad in China and you've got a daughter. And for every daughter, there are like 20 males looking for a wife. What would you do? I know exactly what I'd do as a dad. I would expect a dowry, right? Because it's always been female choice, but in this scenario, she's got like 20 guys to choose from. Which one? And this is strictly business dealing, man. This is strictly transactional. Love's got nothing to do with it. We're talking about, all right, who's got the most money, who has the most property, who has the most resources, whatever. In other words, there are going to be 19 guys that are going without. And what's that going to do to social stability? Social stability is in the toilet. Because those 19 frustrated guys are going to be something you got to deal with. Right? That's why they abandoned the one-child policy. So that isn't going to work. I mean, it does work, but it has consequences, and the consequences are not good. hey, maybe we're looking at the wrong end. Maybe what we should pay attention to is the death rate. What can we do to increase the death rate? Well, COVID-19 comes to mind. We could outlaw condoms. And by outlawing condoms, we could spread venereal diseases far and wide. That would be great. Nietzsche died of syphilis. Okay. Trump was boasting about his Vietnam experience and the number of times he had to get penicillin to treat his syphilis. That would be good, wouldn't it? What else could we do to increase the death rate? I know. Anybody that's in federal prison, we execute them. Kill all the felons. Prisons would be empty. It'd be great. Think of the money we'd save. Would that solve the problem? I mean, these are scary people in those federal lockups. All these felons, the Michael Cohens, right? Jack the Ripper sort of guys, Paul Manafort sort of guys, Charles Manson. Just such a delightful segment of society. We could execute all those people. Or wouldn't that help? No, it wouldn't help. Why wouldn't it solve any problems? How many babies do people behind bars make? They don't make babies. They're behind bars. Okay? If you're a felon behind bars, right? You're not going to be made, if you're on death row, if you're a prisoner, you're not part of the problem. You're not out there making babies. You've been removed from the population. So killing all the prisoners doesn't work. What else could we do?
Limit access to healthcare.
Limit access to health care. We're doing that, right? We're getting rid of Obamacare. It's gone. You know, especially with the new Supreme Court, that'll be gone. So we have all these uninsured people. We'll change hospitals so they can no longer treat you if you don't have insurance. Most hospitals are like that already. I used to work at a hospital and there was a car accident it was a private hospital, there was a car accident right in front of the hospital. And they wanted to bring this one person who was critically injured into the hospital. And at the emergency room they said, does he have insurance? And they didn't know. He says, no, we can't take him. So they refused to treat this guy. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah, I will, refuse medical care. That's what we're going towards, right? I mean, who knows? Maybe that's what the real deal behind the plan to remove Obamacare is, bring the population under control by having. Unfortunately, what's the real consequence of removing health care from all these people? They don't die right away, right? So they're using up enormous amounts of resources and so on. So it's firing squads. Traffic stop goes bad, execute them right there. Okay, that'll work. Speeding ticket, execute. Parking fine, execute. Talk about a well-behaved society. It would be amazing. Wouldn't that be cool? It'd be awesome. Spit on the street, executing. Urinating in public, execute him. I mean, in all seriousness now, how can we increase the death rate? What can we do? Remove health care.
Start a war.
Not enough people die in wars. We're not killing enough people. I mean, we're really good at war. We are. As a country, we are amazing at war. Okay? I mean, shock and awe. We can just obliterate places. But we don't kill enough people. It doesn't, I mean, what we need to do is remove basically half the people from the planet. How do we increase the death rate? Yeah, it's a problem, right? Think about modern science and modern medicine. It's all about saving lives, not, throwing lives away. So if we can't increase the death rate and we haven't figured out a way to bring down the birth rate, I think it has to be something with the birth rate. How can we reduce the birth rate? All right. Let's think about it in a slightly different way. We know, deep down in your bones that Darwin understood that can't go on for very long. You know that there's an upper limit to how many organisms can survive. And we refer to that limit as the carrying capacity. So the environment can support a certain number of people. Okay? No more than that. And what happens is, as the population approaches the carrying capacity, something changes. And the population does this. That's called flattening the curve. Okay? That's exactly what we were looking for early in this pandemic. And we never got there. Okay? We're still in this phase right here. We never got to this phase right here. Okay? So something is going to happen to the population. What's going to happen? Well, a couple of things. As the population approaches the carrying capacity, food becomes scarce. And what that means is there are a lot of hungry people. And the thing about hungry people is they don't have the energy to bring a baby to full term. They don't have a job. They're more susceptible to disease. They're more susceptible to all sorts of different dangers. Their life expectancy drops. Okay? So if you're one of the people without food, right, your chances of surviving are reduced. And that's one of the things that the cost of living is going to go up. Your ability to have an apartment is going to go down. Suddenly you're homeless. If you're homeless, it's hard to bring a baby to term. Okay? So if you're homeless, the number of reproductive opportunities that present themselves is going to go down. So as the population reaches its carrying capacity, the population will level off all by itself. And we can model that very easily. So we have dn dt. So change in n, the number of individuals in the population relative to time, is going to be equal to Rn times 1 minus n over k, where k is the carrying capacity. Look what happens. What happens if n is below k? N is smaller than k. If n is smaller than k, what is the fraction n over k? It's a number less than 1. 1 minus the number that's smaller than 1 gives you a positive number. A positive number times a positive number is positive. So if n is less than k, then the population is going to increase. What happens if n is larger than k? So this is population size n, and this is time. If n is bigger than k, then n divided by k is a number larger than 1. 1 minus a number that's larger than itself is a negative number. A negative number times a positive is a negative. So now the population is going to decrease. Okay? What happens if n is equal to k? There we are. N is equal to k. If n is equal to k, n divided by k is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. 0 times the positive number is 0, so there's no change. dn dt is equal to 0. So then we stay right there. N is equal to k, n is less than k, n equals k, and n greater than k. All right? Now there is one interesting phenomenon though, and that is this. If the growth rate is too large, if the growth rate does this, the population is going to oscillate around the carrying capacity. So it won't approach it and level off before it approaches it. It'll overshoot it and then oscillate it. And what that means is, at that phase, and there, and there, and there, every time you have one of those humps, you're going to get a lot of suffering and death and misery. So the population overshoots and then starts to crash, overshoots again, crashes, overshoots, and crashes. If it increases, if R is a little bit larger still, the oscillations become larger and last longer. If the growth rate is a little bit larger still, the population crashes. It goes to extinction. So the question is, which one are we in? Are we in this mode, that mode, or that mode? For the human population, which one are we in? There is another important consideration, and that is, what determines the carrying capacity? What is our carrying capacity? It's easy to figure out. How could you figure out the carrying capacity? So this is population size, and this is B or D, the death rate. What happens to the death rate as population size increases?
Goes up.
It goes up. Think about the death rate in small town America versus the death rate in a city. Death rate in the city is higher. Why is that? More car accidents, more industrial accidents, more people hit by buses and trains, more people shot in gang violence. As population density goes up, the level of aggression in the population goes up. Okay? More people are pissed off, more people are upset. Okay? Stress goes up, the death rate goes up. How's about the birth rate? What happens to the birth rate? So number of births per 1,000 people. What happens to the birth rate as the population size goes up? It decreases. Okay? When things get really, really, really crowded, how likely are you to have sex? There you are, you're in an apartment with 12 other people. And all you want is a little special time with your partner. How's that going to work out? Right? There are all these other people and you can't get any privacy. The reproductive rate goes down. Okay? So now you want to know where the carrying capacity is? It's when the birth rate is equal to the death rate. Because when B minus D, when births equal deaths, then B minus D is equal to 0. Right? So it's at that point where you've reached that. Because at that point, dn dt is equal to 0. So that's the carrying capacity. Okay. So the birth rate is equal to the death rate. Right there. All right. Now, think about that carrying capacity. What determines our carrying capacity?
Our resources.
Our resources. The amount of water. The amount of land. The amount of agriculture. The amount of energy. Can you list 2 resources that are probably more important than anything else? Water. What else? Okay. Who in here is wearing clothing that is made strictly of cotton or wool? Cotton, wool, or leather? It's all blended of one flavor or another. Polyester, nylon, whatever else. All these synthetic materials. How do they make those synthetic materials? What is polyester made from? What's nylon made from? Oil. What are plastics made from? Oil. Oil is not just for gasoline and diesel and lubricants. It's also in this marker made with oil. The plastic up here made from oil. Almost everything in that video camera made from oil. These desktops, I think the covering at least is made from oil. Okay, it's all plastics. So let's talk about oil supply. What's sort of interesting about the world oil situation at the current time? What's happened to the price of oil? It's dropped dramatically. Okay? The price of oil right now is what, about how many dollars a barrel? $30 or $40 a barrel? Okay? But that's temporary, okay? It used to be when Bill Clinton was president, the cost of oil per barrel was $17. When W was president, it was all the way up to $100 a barrel, okay? We've increased our oil production because we're getting oil out of shale and things of that sort. But that's a short-term solution. The amount of oil on the planet is finite. We're running out. And when the amount of oil runs out, the carrying capacity will drop like that. And then notice where we are. Okay? All right, we'll pick up on that whole topic next week.